These past few E3s have been kind of disappointing for me. There's been tons of great games, but there's one series that gets me excited like no other. Mass Effect.
And unfortunately, year after year, BioWare has been sharing very little on the fourth entry, Mass Effect Andromeda. We know very little about Andromeda, except for the fact that it takes place in a new galaxy with a brand new suite of characters. But even still, anticipation for this new adventure is growing. So why is that? What is it about Mass Effect that gets so many of us excited? What made millions of gamers explore the Milky Way for hours on end? That inspired thousands of cosplayers, that created an internet movement when the game didn't end the way many wanted. Join me on a journey through the past 10 years of Mass Effect, and maybe we can find out why. Before we can dive into Mass Effect, we need to take a quick look at BioWare Montreal's history and one of its most beloved projects. BioWare was founded in 1995 by a handful of doctors. Yep, Dr. Ray Mazuka, Dr. Greg Zeshuk, and Dr. Augustine Yip, along with 3 others, created one of the most well-known RPG studios of all time. The team cut their teeth on a handful of successful role-playing games, including Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, but it wasn't until a partnership with LucasArts at the dawn of the new millennium that they would finally work on their opus. The game in question was something Lucas fans have been screaming out for years. A Star Wars game where you could create your own character, command your own spaceship, explore iconic planets, and assemble a team. Throughout the main quest, players were able to make decisions, both good and evil, which ultimately affected the ending. The name? Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. At this time, BioWare were no stranger to RPGs, but Knights of the Old Republic marked a lot of departures for what they typically did. For starters, KOTOR was projected to be much shorter than most of the developers' previous games, and it would put a lot more focus on storytelling than anything before that.
It was through this that project director Casey Hudson was able to lay the framework for what the team was calling Project SFX.
One September morning in 2003, Hudson sat down with the doctors and didn't just pitch one game, but 3. He envisioned an ambitious trilogy where your character, actions, and choices are carried over from one game to the next. As the story goes, Mazuka still remembers burning his tongue on hot soup during Hudson's bold pitch. The ambition didn't end there either. Hudson wanted to make a game that spanned an entire galaxy, with a fast-paced combat system that would rival third-person action games. The game would be developed by the same team that created Knights of the Old Republic. He imagined a game where players could freely explore planets, and an online component that sounded awfully similar to Destiny or The Division. The original pitch document mentions virtual environments where you can meet other players and trade items with them in a dynamic in-game economy. Online didn't quite make the cut, but the doctors gave Hudson the green light and pre-production began. The team spent the first year putting the building blocks in place for this massive universe. Hudson and art director Derek Watts wanted to create a vision of the future that was clean and slick. A universe where form was just as important as style. Hudson felt that at the time most science fiction was dark and gritty, and that Mass Effect could touch on a style of science fiction that hadn't been tapped into with games. Drawing inspiration from futuristic art of the 70s and 80s and films like Red Planet and Solaris, codename SFX soon became Mass Effect. Most of us love the sleek environments and fast-paced gameplay, but the exploration was a little more divisive. You either loved it or hated it, but let's be honest, you probably hated it. I'm talking about the Mako. This was your way of exploring dozens of, well, rather bland and optional worlds Mass Effect had to offer. There was a red planet, a green planet, a blue planet, a white one, and a couple other colors. If you were lucky, you'd come across a crate-filled room, but after that, you've seen all the crate-filled rooms Mass Effect had to offer. Unfortunately, the technology at the time made it difficult for BioWare to create multiple and truly unique planets. But Casey Hudson and his team did manage to pull off the combat. It may have not been as polished as third-person shooters at the time, like Epic's Gears of War, but it was still a huge change compared to the shooting in Knights of the Old Republic. Instead of tactically assigning characters to fight NPCs, combat was in real time, and it actually played pretty well for the time. This is partly because early on the team decided that they would focus on ranged combat for the SFX project. This would make weapon tweaking and balancing much easier, and it was another way to disassociate their new spacefaring IP from Star Wars. Players were able to combine firearms with biotic powers, tech skills, and squad abilities in order to take down enemies. From there, players could experiment with different weapons, armor mods, and bullet types to make weapons feel like their own. This feature was actually surprisingly in-depth. Unfortunately, a lot of it was buried under clunky and complicated menus. The combat also evolved quite a bit over the course of development. During one of the early trailers, BioWare showed off a system like KOTOR, allowed players to swap between squad members in order to carry out different objectives and to find enemy weak points. Instead, BioWare settled for a squad command feature that would allow you to use squad mates' abilities on the fly and tell them where to go and what to do. Despite the heavy focus on action-based combat, Mass Effect was still first and foremost an RPG. Throughout the game, you were constantly collecting new equipment, weapons, mods, and armor not just for Shepard, but your entire team. Mass Effect also had one of the most in-depth leveling systems of the three. You could personalize every squad mate down to the pistol he carried and the mods that were attached to it. But Mass Effect didn't quite revolutionize third-person combat or the RPG genre. But what it may have revolutionized is storytelling.
Sovereign will succeed. It is inevitable. My way is the only way any of us will survive.
The presentation took the choose-your-own-adventure style story to new heights. An unobtrusive radial menu would pop up seconds before you would respawn. You'd pick a shortened response, and Shepard's dialogue would cut in seamlessly. The camera would even move and react to Shepard's movements depending on how he'd respond in different situations, giving it a cinematic feel. And if that wasn't cinematic enough, BioWare added a ton of film grain and lens flares. Despite its problems, Mass Effect proved to be an excellent introduction into a universe that would lay the groundwork for one of the most ambitious trilogies ever created. Gamers and critics were quick to point out its shortcomings, but what worked really well. BioWare had created a huge universe teeming with stories to tell, and the possibilities were endless. In 2009, fans were greeted with a cryptic teaser for BioWare's follow-up. The teaser listed some of Shepard's achievements from the first game, and it ended with a line of text saying, "He or she was killed in action." At the time, we didn't know what to make of it. Could Shepard really be dead? BioWare doubled down on this marketing strategy after the teaser by concealing Shepard's face in early demos. I don't think most fans fell for this stunt, but deep down, I was a bit worried that maybe the tech wasn't quite there to make a series where your decisions carried across multiple games. Fortunately, I was dead wrong. Characters that had died for some players were entirely written out in 2, and decisions you made in the first game had rippling effects on the state of the galaxy. Mass Effect 2 truly felt like an experience that had been molded by the player. But it's hard to talk about Mass Effect 2 without acknowledging its change in direction. Exploration was toned down, the Mako was cut altogether, most of the RPG elements were stripped clean, and it was also much darker. The sequel turned out to be much more action and story focused.
Fans were taken aback by these changes, but as it turns out, Mass Effect 2 was a much more focused and refined version of a series gamers were quickly falling in love with.
Mass Effect 2 was an exercise in focus, and what was left intact was polished close to perfection. The lighting and textures were better, the combat felt much tighter, the characters were somehow even more interesting, and the cutscenes weren't nearly as restrictive as before. With a cast of 12 squad mates, there was no shortage of personality aboard the Normandy. Mordin was a cold but eccentric Solarian, Legion was a Geth that could operate independently, and Grunt was a Krogan bred for war. Each character had a fleshed out backstory and loyalty missions where you could strengthen your bond with that character. These missions were optional, but I'd go as far to say that BioWare told some of their finest stories through these side quests. But one of the most startling things about Mass Effect 2 was how much darker it was than its predecessor. Human colonies were being abducted by the thousands, new squad mates like Jack and Thane were cold-blooded killers, and Shepard had defected to a human extremist group called Cerberus. The dominating blue hues were replaced with red, and the lighting was very similar to dark noir films such as Blade Runner. And if you played Mass Effect 2 like I did, Shepard was mad. Really mad.
He's willing to offer you reinstatement as a Spectre.
Take your offer and cram it up your ass. I didn't need your help to stop Sovereign, and I don't need it now.
To no surprise though, Mass Effect 2 was a hit. Fans and critics fell in love with the sequel, and I think it's safe to say that Mass Effect 2 is regarded as the fan favorite among the three. The complex narrative weaved multiple story and character threads together that all factored into a climactic suicide mission ending. And if you really fucked up, it wasn't out of the question for Shepard to die. For most of us though, Shepard didn't die, and that's a good thing because Shepard's story wasn't quite over yet. On March 5th, 2012, at 11 p.m. I was standing in line at my local GameStop. I was already short on sleep after marathoning my perfect run-through through Mass Effect 1 and 2, and I was freezing my ass off. When the clock hit midnight, I picked up my copy of Mass Effect 3's Collector's Edition, and I broke a few traffic laws to get home as quickly as I could. I ended up staying up all night and missing class the following day. All the dominoes had been set up over the course of 6 years, and they were finally starting to fall. Decisions I'd completely forgotten about came full circle, like the Rachni Queen on Noveria and Captain Kira Hayes' fate on Vermeer. People had vastly different experiences, all based on big and little decisions they had made in 1 and 2. Mass Effect 3 also marked the return for some of its RPG elements. It was still very much an action game, but the leveling up system was more in-depth, and weapon and character customization were taken to further lengths. It was still a little light on exploration, but with the impending threat of the Reapers, would there really be much time for exploring? Probably not. So instead, BioWare took another shot at the combat and managed to squeeze in the last puzzle piece that was always missing: melee attacks. For the first time in the series, everything just kind of melded together. I'd take down an enemy's shield with disruptor rounds, command Liara to suspend an enemy with her biotics, and then I'd rush in for the kill. Unfortunately, it's tough to talk about all of Mass Effect 3's achievements without mentioning the ending. To say expectations were high is an understatement. But the endings we got weren't quite what fans were hoping for. All your decisions over the course of 3 games boiled down to 3 endings. To make matters worse, fans criticized these 3 endings for appearing largely the same. I'm sure you remember the countless pick your favorite color and scumbag Shepard memes that poked fun at the ending. Fans were quick to point out plot holes, and a lot of your decisions ended up feeling inconsequential.
This didn't sit well with fans, and they were vocal.
It didn't stop with the YouTube comments and threatening tweets either. Within days, a petition popped up online demanding BioWare fix their ending. Developers were even getting death threats. One poll in particular showed that 91% of 70,000 fans were disappointed with the ending. The team was crushed. After 10 years of development, fans swore off the series altogether just because of those last 2 hours. But it didn't take too long for BioWare to set things straight. A few months after release, BioWare gave fans an extended cut of the ending that covered up some plot holes and added a little bit more meat to the ending. But the wound was still fresh. However, just talking about Mass Effect's ending doesn't do Mass Effect 3 justice. The ending may not have taken into account your previous choices, but the entire game did. I had 3 different saves prepared going into Mass Effect 3. A Paragon save, a Renegade save, and a save where I did whatever I wanted to. And each playthrough felt different. Missions would vary, characters would be absent in some playthroughs, and relationships were dramatically different. And now that the ending wounds have mostly healed, it's easy to see how impressive the Mass Effect trilogy is. Hudson and BioWare's high ambitions were met. And after the beloved Citadel DLC, the studio took a well-deserved break from the franchise. So here we are. It's 2016 and there's a new Mass Effect game deep in development. The game was announced shortly after Mass Effect 3, but since then the studio has been tight-lipped. Apart from a trailer and some behind-the-scenes documentaries, we still don't really know what this game will be. A few things are for certain though. Mass Effect Andromeda will take place in the, you guessed it, Andromeda Galaxy. Based on rumors and leaks, it sounds like the new protagonist will be tasked with colonizing habitable planets in the Andromeda Galaxy. It also looks like the Mako is making a return, and that can only mean one thing: exploration. Based on the trailer we saw at E3 last year, there should be dozens, maybe even hundreds of planets to explore. There's even some rumors circulating that you'll be able to seamlessly pilot your spaceship between planets within a dense galaxy. Even with this, it's still hard to nail down exactly what Mass Effect Andromeda will be at this point. But based on everything we've heard so far, this sounds like the Mass Effect game BioWare and fans envisioned with the first one. For me personally, I hope BioWare does away with all the grand and epic storylines. The best part of the Mass Effect games have always been the characters and the relationships players were able to forge with them. I don't want to save the galaxy again, I don't even want to save the universe. I want to explore uncharted worlds and meet new and interesting characters.
20 years from now, we're not going to look at Mass Effect for its combat or for its endings. When we look back on Mass Effect, we're going to think about the characters it created and the stories it told.